Welcome back to The Duke's Revenge, where the coldest hearts burn the hottest and refusal ignites obsession. I'm so glad you're here with me today for a tale of devastating pride, calculated destruction, and the moment when the most powerful man in England realized he'd destroyed the only woman he'd ever wanted. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love seeing our community span across continents, from midnight listeners to those joining me with their morning tea. Tonight's story takes us to the glittering, merciless world of 1,850 seconds, London, where a young woman committed the ultimate sin against aristocratic expectations. She refused a duke. Not just any duke, but the Duke of Ravenscroft, whose wealth controlled half of England's shipping trade and whose word could ruin families with a single letter. Society said she was mad. Her family called her ungrateful. But Philippa Hartwell had her reasons she could never speak aloud. What she didn't know was that her refusal hadn't ended his interest. It had ignited something far more dangerous. They whispered that the Duke of Ravenscroft never forgot a slight. They were right. But what they didn't understand was that his revenge wasn't born of wounded pride. It was born of something far more terrifying. A love so consuming that when she rejected him, he decided if he couldn't have her, he would ensure she had nothing else. Let me take you back to that February evening when Philippa stood in the ruins of everything she'd once known, when the man who'd systematically destroyed her family's name, fortune, and future walked through the door of her crumbling townhouse and did something no one in London society could have predicted. The rain had been falling for 3 days when Julian Ashworth, Duke of Ravenscroft, received the invitation that would alter the trajectory of his carefully ordered life. The heavy cream paper, embossed with the Hartwell family crest, a modest shield bearing 3 wheat sheaves, felt almost weightless in his gloved hand as he stood in the amber glow of his study. Outside, Berkeley Square glistened with February rain, the gas lamps creating wavering pools of gold on the black pavement. Inside, the fire crackled with applewood, filling the room with warmth that never quite reached the cold hollow beneath his ribs. "Another country family seeking elevation," his secretary murmured, barely concealing the disdain that London's elite reserved for those whose wealth came from land rather than centuries of noble breeding. The Hartwells, minor gentry from Derbyshire. The father made his fortune in wool manufacturing before purchasing a small estate. They have 3 daughters, all unmarried. The invitation is for their winter ball, likely their attempt to debut the eldest in London society. Julian turned the invitation slowly between his fingers, noting the quality of the paper, expensive but not extravagant. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, educated. "What do we know of the daughters?" "Very little, Your Grace. They keep to themselves. The eldest is 24, quite old for a debut, which suggests either strong principles or lack of suitable offers. The middle daughter is said to be the beauty, already receiving attention from several minor nobles. The youngest is only 16. 24. Julian felt something shift in his chest, though he couldn't have named it. In 1852, a woman of 24 who remained unmarried was either desperately poor, hopelessly plain, or possessed of a will that most men found threatening. The fact that the Hartwells were hosting a ball suggested poverty wasn't the issue. His curiosity, that dangerous faculty that had driven him to build a shipping empire that rivaled the Crown's own naval power, stirred like a beast waking from slumber. "Accept the invitation," he said quietly, "and find out everything about the Hartwell daughters. Everything." His secretary's eyebrows rose fractionally, the only sign of surprise the man ever showed. In the 5 years since Julian had inherited the dukedom at 28, following his father's sudden death from a stroke, he had attended perhaps a dozen social events. He conducted his business from the shadows, made his fortune in shipping contracts and railway investments, and kept his personal life as locked away as the private ledgers in his study's hidden safe. The Ton whispered about him, the cold duke, the ruthless duke, the duke who'd rejected every eligible lady in England without explanation. What they didn't know, what Julian barely acknowledged, even to himself, was that he wasn't cold. He was careful. He'd watched his father destroy 3 women with his careless passions, his mother, dead from heartbreak at 35, when the old duke's mistress bore him a son, the mistress herself, cast aside when she became inconvenient, and the maid his father had ruined, who drowned herself in the Thames. Julian had learned early that men of great power inflicted great damage, and he'd sworn he would never become that kind of destruction. Better to feel nothing than to feel too much. Better to remain alone than to ruin someone with his intensity. The Hartwell ball was held in a rented townhouse on Half Moon Street, respectable but not fashionable, the kind of address that announced ambition without the fortune to support it. Julian arrived unfashionably late, as was his habit, his black formal coat perfectly tailored to his tall frame, his dark hair swept back from the sharp angles of his face. The butler who took his card looked momentarily stunned. The Duke of Ravenscroft's presence transformed any social event from hopeful to significant. The ballroom was modest by ducal standards, but charming in its simplicity. Winter roses expensive, a statement of resources filled crystal vases. The orchestra was competent. Thank you for watching. Thanks for watching. The Finding. End quote. The ballroom was modest by ducal standards. The guests were a mixture of country gentry and minor London nobility, the kind of people who attended events for genuine enjoyment rather than social calculation. Julian felt immediately out of place, a wolf at a gathering of sheep, and was considering a swift exit when he saw her. She stood near the terrace doors, partially hidden by a potted palm, wearing a gown of deep blue silk that suggested her family had resources but lacked the fashionable modist connections of the true elite. Her hair, a rich auburn that caught the candlelight, was arranged simply, without the elaborate curls and jewels that adorned the other women. But it was her face that arrested him. Not beautiful in the conventional sense, but striking, intelligent, with gray eyes that watched the dancing couples with an expression of such fierce, barely concealed longing that Julian felt it like a physical blow. This was the eldest daughter. This was the woman who, at 24, had remained unmarried despite her family's obvious desire to see her settled. Julian watched her for 10 minutes, noting how she moved closer to the dancers only to retreat when approached, how her gloved hands clenched the silk of her skirt when a particular waltz began, how her throat worked when a younger woman, her sister, based on the similar features, was led onto the floor by an eager lieutenant. There was a story written in every tense line of her body, and Julian discovered he needed to know it the way he needed air. He crossed the ballroom with the focused intensity that characterized everything he did, aware of the ripple of recognition that followed him, the way conversations paused and resumed in hushed tones. He'd learned to ignore it, this constant surveillance that came with being one of the wealthiest, most powerful unmarried men in England. But he felt it more acutely now, this pressure of observation, because he was doing something unprecedented. He was approaching a woman no one else had noticed. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice pitched low to avoid drawing more attention than necessary. She turned, those remarkable gray eyes lifting to meet his, and Julian saw the exact moment she recognized him. Her expression didn't change, a remarkable feat of self-control, but color bloomed across her cheekbones, and her breathing quickened just slightly beneath the modest neckline of her gown. "Your Grace," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, cultured but with a hint of Derbyshire's softer vowels. "I'm afraid I don't dance." It was a polite refusal, the kind any woman might offer. But Julian heard something else beneath it, not shyness, not simpering false modesty, but genuine unwillingness. Refusal. He'd been refused exactly twice in his adult life. Once by a railway consortium he'd crushed within 6 months, and once by a corrupt shipping official he'd had removed from office. The sensation of being denied was so foreign, so strangely exhilarating, that he found himself smiling a real smile, not the cold expression he showed the world. "You don't dance? Or you choose not to dance, Miss Hartwell? There's a significant difference." Her chin lifted fractionally, a gesture of defiance that sent heat pooling in Julian's chest. "I choose not to, Your Grace. I find I lack both the grace and the patience for the ritual." Honesty, actual, Unvarnished honesty from a young woman addressing a duke. Julian felt something crack inside him, some careful wall he'd built to keep the world at a safe distance. He should have walked away. Every instinct honed by years of self-protection screamed at him to retreat, to remember what happened when men like him allowed themselves to want. Instead, he said, "Then perhaps you might honor me with a turn about the terrace. I find I share your lack of patience for ritual, and the air in here has grown stifling." He saw her hesitation, saw the war between propriety and desire flicker across her expressive features. The terrace was visible through glass doors, chaperoned by a dozen watchful eyes, but it would still be remarkably forward for an unmarried woman to walk alone with a duke she'd just met. Julian waited, finding himself holding his breath like a boy, hoping she would accept. "Very well, Your Grace," she said finally, and Julian realized with a shock that his heart was racing. The terrace was cold, winter air cutting through the wool of his evening coat, but he barely noticed. Philippa Hartwell stood at the stone balustrade, her gloved hands clasped before her, her breath visible in small clouds that disappeared into the February darkness. Below them, Half Moon Street stretched away toward Piccadilly, the sounds of London distant carriage wheels, the cry of a street seller, the bark of a dog muffled by the rain that had finally stopped. "You must think me very rude, Your Grace," she said without turning, "to refuse a duke's invitation to dance at my own family's ball." "I think you're honest," Julian replied, moving to stand beside her but maintaining a careful distance. "An increasingly rare quality in my experience." She turned then, studying his face with a directness that most women avoided. "Why did you come tonight? This isn't your world. We're barely gentry by London standards. And you're—" She gestured helplessly, as if his power and status were too vast to articulate. "I came because I was curious," he admitted, and realized it was the first entirely truthful thing he'd said to anyone in months. "Your sister's reputation precedes her. I wanted to see if the famous beauty of the Hartwell family lived up to her billing." Pain flashed across Philippa's face, quickly suppressed, but Julian caught it. And caught, too, the way she'd misunderstood his statement assumed he'd come to assess the beautiful middle daughter, not the overlooked eldest. The realization that she thought herself invisible, unchosen, forgettable, struck him with unexpected force. "And does she," Philippa asked, her voice carefully neutral, "live up to the billing?" "I haven't noticed," Julian said bluntly. "I've been watching you." The confession hung between them in the cold air. Philippa's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise, and Julian saw her reassess him entirely, saw her recognize that his interest was real, focused, and entirely fixed on her rather than the more obviously suitable sister circulating inside. "Why?" The question was barely a whisper. "Because," Julian said, taking a step closer, close enough to see the flecks of silver in her gray eyes. "You looked at those dancing couples as if witnessing something beautiful and terrible simultaneously. Because you hid behind a potted palm at your own ball. Because when I approached you, you didn't simper or blush or calculate your advantage. You simply refused me. Do you have any idea how extraordinary that is?" "Most would call it rude," she managed. "Most are fools." He paused, aware he was being far too frank, too intense, too immediately honest with this woman he'd known for less than an hour. "May I ask you something, Miss Hartwell?" She nodded, still watching him with those penetrating gray eyes. "Why don't you dance? And please, don't offer me platitudes about grace or patience. The truth." For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she turned back to the balustrade, gripping the cold stone, and said, "When I was 19, I was engaged to be married. He was a gentleman farmer, the son of our neighbors in Derbyshire. Kind, gentle. We were to be wed in the spring." She paused, her throat working. 3 weeks before the wedding, he was thrown from his horse during a hunt. He broke his back. For 2 months, he lingered, paralyzed, in terrible pain. I sat with him every day, watched him waste away, heard him beg for death. Julian felt his chest constrict. "I'm sorry." "Everyone was sorry," Philippa continued. her voice flat with old pain. "But sorry didn't change that I watched the man I was supposed to marry die by inches while I held his hand." Sorry didn't change that. He made me promise, at the end, that I would never marry anyone I didn't love with my whole heart, that I wouldn't settle for comfort or security or duty. She turned back to Julian, tears glittering unshed in her eyes. "I don't dance, Your Grace, because every waltz reminds me of our betrothal ball. Every turnabout the floor reminds me of promises I can't keep and dreams that died in a sick room that smelled of laudanum and despair." The silence stretched between them, heavy with her confession. Julian understood with sudden clarity why she remained unmarried at 24. Not because she lacked beauty or grace or wit, but because she'd loved once, completely, and lost everything. Because she'd made a deathbed promise that ensured she would remain alone rather than settle. Because she was waiting for something her heart recognized as worthy of the pain she'd endured. "Thank you," Julian said quietly, "for trusting me with that truth." She smiled then, sad and small. "I don't know why I told you. I've never told anyone the full story. Not even my parents know about the promise. They think I'm simply difficult, choosy. They don't understand that I'm not choosing to refuse everyone. I'm honoring a dead man's final wish that I not waste my life on anything less than genuine love." Julian knew in that moment that he should walk away. This woman was dangerous not because she was manipulative or calculating, but because she was real. Because her honesty called to something in him that he'd buried years ago. Something that wanted to be known rather than feared, chosen rather than useful. But instead of walking away, he heard himself say, "Would you consider calling on me tomorrow at my townhouse in Berkeley Square? I'd like to continue this conversation away from the performance of balls and society." Her eyes widened. "Your Grace, that would be highly improper. An unmarried woman, alone in a bachelor's residence." "Bring your mother," Julian interrupted. "Or your sister, or both. I don't care about propriety, Miss Hartwell. I care about speaking with you again, without an audience, studying every word." She studied his face for a long moment, and Julian saw the exact instant she made her decision. "Very well, tomorrow at 3 o'clock, but I make no promises beyond conversation, Your Grace." "Julian," he corrected. "When we're alone, call me Julian. Only if you call me Philippa." He smiled, really smiled, for the second time that evening. "Philippa, tomorrow at 3. What Julian didn't anticipate, as he left the ball that night, was that Philippa Hartwell would consume his thoughts for every hour until she arrived at his door. He couldn't concentrate on the shipping contracts requiring his signature, couldn't focus on the railway investment proposal his solicitors had prepared. Instead, he found himself standing at the window of his study, watching Berkeley Square in the gray February light, waiting with an impatience that frightened him in its intensity. She arrived precisely at 3, accompanied by her mother, a nervous, fluttering woman who clearly couldn't believe her difficult eldest daughter had captured the attention of a duke. Julian received them in his formal drawing room, a space designed to intimidate with its Baroque paintings and priceless French furniture, and watched Philippa take it all in with those assessing gray eyes. They talked for 2 hours, about books Philippa had read Wuthering Heights 3 times and had passionate opinions about Catherine Earnshaw's destructive choices. About politics, she believed the Factory Acts didn't go far enough to protect child workers and argued her position with a command of statistics that surprised Julian. About art, music, philosophy, the changing face of England as the industrial age transformed centuries-old ways of living. Julian found himself contributing his own opinions, engaging in actual debate rather than the polite nothings that passed for conversation in most social settings. Philippa challenged him, disagreed with him, made him defend positions he'd never questioned. And through it all, her mother sat in nervous silence, clearly overwhelmed by the intensity of the discussion. When they rose to leave, Julian did something that shocked even himself. He took Philippa's gloved hand and said, "Marry me." The words fell into the drawing room like stones into still water. Philippa's mother gasped. Philippa herself went pale, then flushed, her hand trembling in his. "Your Grace." Julian, she corrected, her voice shaking. "We've known each other for less than 24 hours. You can't possibly—" "I can and I am," Julian interrupted, aware he was handling this with all the finesse of a railway negotiation, but unable to stop himself. "I'm 33 years old, Philippa. I've spent the last 5 years deliberately avoiding exactly this, avoiding marriage, avoiding connection, avoiding the risk of becoming like my father, who destroyed everyone he touched with his careless passions. But you—" He tightened his grip on her hand, aware of her mother's scandalized expression, but unable to care. "You make me want to take the risk. You make me want to be chosen, known, real, rather than carefully controlled." "You don't love me," Philippa whispered, but Julian heard the uncertainty in her voice. "I don't know you well enough yet to use that word," he agreed. "But I know enough to recognize that what I feel when I'm with you is more genuine, more consuming than anything I've experienced in my entire careful, controlled life. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that you feel something similar." He saw the truth in her eyes before she spoke. She did feel it. This unexpected, immediate connection that defied all rational explanation. But he also saw fear and something else, a shadow of old pain, old promises. "I need time," she said finally. "I can't. I won't make this decision in a moment of passion. If you're serious, truly serious, then court me properly. Give me time to know you, to see if what we feel now can survive the reality of daily life. And if, at the end of that time, I believe we could build something real together, I'll give you my answer." It was a fair request, a reasonable request. Everything Julian knew about business negotiation told him to accept, to give her the time and space she needed. But everything he felt, the desperate, consuming need that had come alive in his chest from the moment he'd first seen her watching the dancers, with longing in her eyes, rebelled against waiting. He wanted her now. Wanted her promise, her presence, her permanence in his life, before something could happen to take her away. 2 months, he heard himself say. "I'll court you for 2 months, Philippa, but at the end of that time, I'll require your answer. Yes or no. I won't live in uncertainty indefinitely." She nodded slowly. 2 months. "And Julian, I meant what I said about my promise. I won't marry anyone I don't love completely. If, at the end of 2 months, I don't feel that certainty, my answer will be no, regardless of your title, your wealth, or how much I enjoy our conversations." He should have found her terms insulting. Should have reminded her that duchesses were born, not made, and that dozens of women from the finest families would leap at the opportunity she was qualified, as if it were merely agreeable rather than life-changing. Instead, he found her honesty exhilarating. "Understood. 2 months to convince you I'm worthy of your promise." What followed were 8 weeks that would later seem like both an eternity and an instant. Julian called on Philippa every day that social propriety allowed. They walked in Hyde Park despite the cold March winds, debated in his drawing room with her increasingly comfortable mother as chaperone, attended the theater together in his private box, where they ignored the opera in favor of whispered conversations that ranged from profound to ridiculous. He learned that she'd taught herself Latin using her late fiancé's university texts, that she wrote poetry she never showed anyone, that she had nightmares about death and woke sometimes unable to breathe, that she loved thunderstorms but feared small, enclosed spaces, that she believed in God but struggled with a deity who allowed good men to die in agony while corrupt ones thrived. And he told her things he'd never voiced, about watching his mother waste away from grief, about the day he'd found the maid's body in the Thames, her pockets weighted with stones, about the terror that he carried his father's capacity for destruction, that his intensity would harm anyone he let too close, about the loneliness of being feared rather than known. "You're not your father," Philippa told him one afternoon in his garden. where early tulips pushed through the cold earth. Your father's cruelty came from carelessness, from treating people as disposable. But you feel too much, not too little. You're not afraid you'll hurt someone through indifference. You're afraid you'll love them so completely it becomes a cage. She saw him, truly saw him, and Julian felt the last of his careful walls crumble into dust. The 2 months passed. The ultimatum approached, and Julian, who'd never doubted himself in business or politics, found himself terrified that Philippa would honor her promise over their connection, that her dead fiancé's final wish would matter more than what they'd built together. On the final day, he took her to his private study, an intimacy he'd granted no one else, not even his closest business associates. Showed her the letters he kept from his mother, the private ledgers where he tracked not just profits but the workers his companies employed, the orphans his anonymous donations supported. Trusted her with the parts of himself he kept hidden from the world. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes," he told her, standing by the window as rain began to fall outside. "I can't promise that my intensity won't sometimes feel overwhelming, that I won't struggle with jealousy when other men look at you, that I won't want to give you everything, even when you need space. But I can promise that I'll try, that I'll listen when you tell me I'm too much, that I'll respect your autonomy even when every instinct screams to protect you from the world. And I can promise that I will never, ever take you for granted the way my father took the women in his life for granted." Philippa stood before him, those gray eyes searching his face. "Ask me again." Julian's heart stopped. Started. "Philippa Hartwell, will you marry me?" She crossed the space between them, took his face in her gloved hands, and said, "No." The word crashed through Julian like a physical blow. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the roaring in his ears that screamed. She'd refused him. She'd chosen the promise over what they had. "No, I won't marry the Duke of Ravenscroft," Philippa continued, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "That title, that power, that carefully controlled version of yourself, you show the world. I have no interest in any of it. But Julian Ashworth, the man who fears he'll love too much, who lies awake worried about orphan children and factory workers, who watched his mother die and swore he'd never cause that kind of pain, him I'll marry. Him I love with my whole heart. Him I choose." For a moment, Julian couldn't process her words. Then understanding crashed over him, followed by a relief so profound he felt his knees weaken. "You're refusing my title, but accepting me?" "I'm honoring my promise," she said, smiling through her tears. "I swore I'd only marry someone I loved completely. Not someone appropriate, not someone advantageous. Someone I couldn't live without. And that's you, Julian. Not the Duke. You." He kissed her then, breaking every rule of propriety, pulling her against him with an intensity that should have frightened them both but instead felt like coming home. She'd said yes. She'd chosen him. She'd seen through the power and the control to the man beneath and decided he was enough. They were married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony in the chapel at his country estate, with only her family and his most trusted household staff in attendance. Julian had expected to feel trapped, constrained by the permanence of vows. Instead, he felt free for the first time since childhood. Free to be himself, to love without careful measure, to trust that Philippa wouldn't break under the weight of his intensity because she'd seen it all and chosen him anyway. Their wedding night, alone in the master bedroom that had belonged to generations of Ravenscroft dukes, Julian held his wife and whispered, "You saved me." "No," Philippa corrected, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "You saved yourself. I just loved you while you did it." They should have been happy. By every rational measure, they were happy deliriously so, in a way that made Julian's staff whisper about the cold Duke transformed, the frightening master who now smiled at breakfast. But happiness, Julian was learning, didn't eliminate the darkness that had driven him to such careful control. It just gave it a new target. The first cracks appeared 4 months into their marriage, at a ball hosted by the Duke of Ashford. Philippa, still adjusting to her new role as a duchess. Wore a stunning emerald gown that Julian had commissioned from London's finest modiste. She looked magnificent, and Julian wasn't the only one who noticed. He watched from across the ballroom as a young earl, recently returned from the continent, approached Philippa with a charming smile. Watched as they spoke, as she laughed at something the man said, as the earl's gaze lingered just slightly too long on the curve of her throat. Jealousy, hot and irrational, flooded through Julian with an intensity that shocked him. She was his wife. His. How dare this presumptuous boy? Julian forced himself to remain where he stood, to breathe through the possessive fury clawing up his throat. Philippa had chosen him. She loved him. There was no rational reason for this consuming need to cross the ballroom and remove her from another man's presence. But rationality, Julian was discovering, had very little to do with the emotions Philippa inspired. He intercepted them as the Earl raised Philippa's gloved hand to his lips, a perfectly acceptable social gesture that made Julian see red. "Lord Westmere," he said, his voice colder than he'd intended. "How kind of you to welcome my wife to London society. But I'm afraid I must steal her away. We have another engagement." They had no such engagement. Philippa knew it, her eyebrows rising fractionally. But she made her excuses to the Earl and accompanied Julian from the ballroom, her hand tucked into his elbow. "Julian," she said quietly once they were in his carriage. "That was rude." "He was looking at you," Julian said flatly. "He was being polite. That's what people do at balls. They look at each other and converse." She studied his face in the dim carriage light. "You're jealous." "I'm aware." He pulled off his gloves with sharp, controlled movements. "I told you I would struggle with this. Other men seeing you, wanting you." "But I don't want them," Philippa interrupted. "I want you. Only you. That should be enough." "It is enough. Intellectually, I know that." Julian closed his eyes, fighting for control. But the feeling remains. This need to ensure no one else can have what's mine. He felt Philippa's hand on his jaw, turning his face toward hers. "I'm not a possession, Julian. I'm your wife, your partner. You don't own me." "I know that too," he said, opening his eyes to meet her steady gaze. "I know every rational argument against what I'm feeling, but knowing doesn't make the feeling less real." They spoke about it that night, long into the early hours. Philippa helped him identify the fear beneath the jealousy, the terror that he'd gotten something too good to keep, that she would realize she'd made a mistake, choosing him over her promise to a dead man, that someone else might offer her the kind of uncomplicated love he could never provide. "You're not going to lose me," she told him, her fingers threading through his hair as they lay tangled together in their bed. "But you could drive me away if you let this jealousy become controlling. I need you to trust me, Julian. Trust that I chose you knowing exactly who you are, and that I'm not looking for an escape." Julian promised to try. And he did try, genuinely, for months. But the darkness in him, the intensity that Philippa had said she loved, kept finding new expressions. He couldn't stand when other men made her laugh, couldn't bear the thought of her attending social events without him, struggled when she wanted time alone with her sisters or mother. He never forbade her anything he remembered his promise about respecting her autonomy. But Philippa saw the tension in him, felt him fighting his own nature, and Julian saw her begin to step more carefully around him, gauging his reactions, managing his emotions. "This isn't what I wanted," he told her one night after she'd declined an invitation to accompany her sister to the opera, because she could sense his discomfort with the young men who would be in attendance. "I don't want you managing me, Philippa. I want you to be free." "Then you need to manage yourself," she said, not unkindly. "Because this intensity, it's beautiful when directed at loving me, but frightening when it becomes about controlling my world. I'm starting to feel like I'm in a beautiful cage. And Julian, I don't do well in cages." Her words haunted him. He knew she was right. Knew he was failing to keep the promise he'd made, that he wouldn't let his intensity become overwhelming. But knowing and changing were different things, and Julian was discovering that some patterns ran deeper than conscious intention. The crisis came on an afternoon in early December, 8 months into their marriage. Philippa received a letter from Derbyshire from her late fiancé's mother, whom she'd stayed close to over the years. The woman was dying, wanted to see Philippa one final time. "I need to go," Philippa told Julian, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. "She's been like a second mother to me since Thomas died. I can't. I have to say goodbye." Every rational part of Julian knew this was reasonable. The woman had been important to Philippa, was dying, deserved this final kindness. But the irrational part, the dark, consuming part he'd never fully controlled, heard something different. Heard that Philippa wanted to return to the place where she'd loved another man. Wanted to visit the grave of someone she'd promised her life to before she'd ever met Julian. "Of course," he heard himself say, voice carefully neutral. "I'll arrange the carriage. We can leave tomorrow." "Julian." Philippa's hand on his arm stopped him. "I think I need to do this alone. She's going to want to talk about Thomas, about those final weeks. I don't think I can process that grief with you beside me, watching, worried about how it affects me." The refusal, because that's what it was, a refusal of his company, his presence, his right as her husband to accompany her, detonated something in Julian's chest. He felt it crack. This careful control he'd maintained for months, felt all the jealousy and possession and terror flood through the broken pieces. "No." The word came out harder than he'd intended. Philippa's eyes widened. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, no. You're not going alone to visit your dead fiancé's mother, so you can spend days reminiscing about the man you promised to marry before me." Julian heard the words emerging from his mouth and couldn't stop. Them. Even though some distant part of him screamed that he was destroying everything. "I mean, no, you're not going to that place where you loved someone else, where every corner reminds you of a life you could have had that didn't include me." "Julian, you're being unreasonable." "Am I?" He rounded on her, something wild and desperate clawing through his chest. "You say you love me, that you chose me, but you're still holding on to him, Philippa. Still honoring his memory, still keeping him alive, through your loyalty to his mother. When does he get to be dead? When do I get to be the only man in your life?" The silence that followed was deafening. Philippa stared at him, her face pale, her eyes filling with tears that didn't fall. "You're asking me to choose between honoring a dying woman's wish and preserving your jealousy of a man who's been dead for 5 years, she said finally, her voice shaking. "You're asking me to cut away pieces of my past, of my grief, because they make you uncomfortable? That's not love, Julian. That's possession." "Maybe it is," Julian said, past caring, past pretending he was anything other than what he'd always feared becoming his father's son, destructive and consuming. "Maybe I am possessive. Maybe I do want to be the only man who matters to you, past or present. Is that so terrible?" "Yes," Philippa whispered. "Yes, it is. Because it means you don't trust me. You don't trust that I can honor Thomas's memory without diminishing what I feel for you. You don't trust that I can love you completely while also being grateful for what he taught me about love." She backed away from him, her hand pressed to her mouth. "You're trying to erase parts of me, Julian. The parts that were formed by experiences you weren't present for. And I won't let you do that." "Then go," Julian heard himself say, the words tasting like ashes. "Go alone to Derbyshire. Visit his grave. Talk about how much you loved him. But when you return, we're going to have a different conversation. About where your loyalties lie. About whether you're truly my wife, or if you're still his widow." Philippa flinched as if he'd struck her. Then, without another word, she turned and left the room. She departed for Derbyshire the next morning, before Julian had risen. Left him a brief note saying she'd be gone a week, that she hoped they could discuss things rationally upon her return. But Julian was past rational. He'd spent the night pacing his study, drinking brandy and replaying the argument, convinced himself that Philippa's need to visit her dead fiancé's mother proved she regretted choosing him. The darkness that had driven him to such careful control for years was fully unleashed now, and it whispered poisonous truths. She doesn't really love you. She settled for your title after the man she actually wanted died. You'll always be second choice. You'll never be enough. By the time dawn broke, Julian had made a decision that would alter everything. If Philippa couldn't fully choose him, if she insisted on maintaining her connection to the past she'd shared with another man, then he would ensure she had no choice. He would make it impossible for her to leave, to regret, to choose anyone or anything else. He would destroy the Hartwell family. The realization of what he was contemplating should have horrified him, should have sent him to his knees, begging forgiveness for even considering such cruelty. But Julian was operating from that place of wounded fury that made terrible things seem not only justified but necessary. Philippa had refused him, had chosen the memory of a dead man over her living husband's needs. She needed to understand that such choices had consequences. Julian began with the factories. The Hartwell fortune, never substantial, rested primarily on their wool manufacturing enterprises in the Midlands. Within 3 days, Julian had quietly purchased the contracts with their major buyers, then canceled them. Within a week, he'd spread rumors through his business networks about financial instability in the Hartwell operations, making it impossible for them to secure new contracts or credit. Then he moved to social destruction. The Hartwells had 3 daughters, all marriage prospects. Julian used his influence, and the power of being the Duke of Ravenscroft couldn't be overstated in 1852 England, to ensure that invitations dried up, that eligible men suddenly developed other interests, that the family found themselves increasingly isolated from the social circles they'd worked so hard to enter. He justified it all with the story he told himself. They had raised Philippa to prioritize her dead fiancé over her living husband. They had encouraged her loyalty to the past at the expense of her present. They were responsible for the ways she couldn't fully be his. Therefore, they deserved what he was doing. The fact that this was insane, that he was destroying innocent people to punish his wife for not loving him the way he demanded, Julian shoved that awareness aside every time it surfaced. He was too far into his rage, too consumed by the need to prove that he mattered, that he was powerful enough to remake the world according to his will, that no one could refuse him without consequences. Philippa returned from Derbyshire after a week to find her husband cold, distant, preternaturally calm. Julian received her in his study, barely looked up from the contracts he was reviewing. "How was your visit?" he asked, as if they were polite strangers rather than a married couple who'd ripped each other apart with their last conversation. "She died the night I arrived," Philippa said quietly. "I held her hand through the end. She was grateful I came." A pause. "She told me Thomas would have been happy I found love again, that I shouldn't feel guilty for choosing to live instead of maintaining a shrine to the dead." The words should have melted Julian's fury, should have made him see how wrong he'd been, how his jealousy had poisoned something that could have been beautiful. But he was too far gone, too committed to the destruction he'd set in motion. "How convenient," he said flatly. "The dying woman's blessing to ease your conscience." Philippa stared at him. "What's happened to you? Julian, you're different. Cold." "I've simply stopped pretending," he replied, finally looking at her directly. "Stopped pretending that this marriage is what I wanted. Stopped pretending that you chose me for anything other than convenience after the man you actually loved died." "That's not true, isn't it?" Julian stood, moved around the desk with the predatory grace that made men nervous in business negotiations. "You refused me, Philippa. The night I asked you to marry me, you refused. Said you couldn't imagine loving the Duke of Ravenscroft. Only the man beneath. But what you didn't realize is that they're inseparable. You can't have one without the other. And now, I think you're regretting your choice." "I'm not regretting, Julian, please. What's going on? Why are you saying these things?" "Because I'm done," he said simply. "Done being second choice. Done competing with a corpse for my own wife's affection. Done pretending that's enough." Philippa's face crumpled. "What does that mean? Are you ending our marriage?" "I can't end it," Julian said, and the cold satisfaction in his voice frightened even himself. "You're my wife. In the eyes of God and the law, you're mine until death." But I can ensure you understand what it means to refuse me." He watched her process his words, saw the moment understanding, and horror dawned. "Julian, what did you do?" "Nothing yet," he lied smoothly. "But I think you'll find that actions have consequences, Philippa, that choosing the past over the present comes with a price. Not sir, nothing yet. Not sir, nothing yet. Nothing yet. Nothing yet." She left his study then, practically running, and Julian let her go. Told himself he didn't care that he just terrified the woman he'd claimed to love. That this was justice, not cruelty. That she deserved his coldness after refusing him, after choosing to honor a dead man's memory instead of her living husband's needs. Within 2 weeks, the consequences of Julian's business maneuvers became visible. The Hartwell factories began failing, unable to secure contracts or credit. Philippa's father arrived in London, desperate, confused, begging to understand why their longtime business partners had suddenly turned away. Julian received him in the same study where he'd announced his intentions to Philippa. Listened to the older man's confusion, his panic, his desperate attempts to understand what had gone wrong. "I believe," Julian said softly when Mr. Hartwell finally fell silent, "that your family has learned an expensive lesson about the importance of loyalty. Your daughter made certain promises when she married me, promises to prioritize her husband above all others, but she seems to struggle with this concept. Perhaps financial pressure will help clarify her thinking." He watched the blood drain from Mr. Hartwell's face. "You're destroying us because Philippa, because she—" The man couldn't even articulate it. So monstrous was the reality. "I'm destroying you," Julian corrected calmly, "because you raised a daughter who doesn't understand her obligations. Consider this an education." Mr. Hartwell fled. Julian poured himself brandy and told himself he felt nothing but satisfaction. Told himself this was justice, not madness. Told himself the image of Philippa's horrified face didn't keep him awake at night, that he didn't sometimes wake in their now cold bed reaching for a wife who'd moved to a separate chamber. Philippa stopped speaking to him entirely after that conversation. Would pass him in the halls of their Berkeley Square townhouse as if he were a particularly distasteful stranger. Julian told himself he didn't care, even as something inside him screamed that he was losing her, that he was proving her right about the cage, about his inability to love her without destroying her. The Hartwell fortune disintegrated over the following months. Julian was thorough, methodical, ruthless in his demolition. He used every connection, every business relationship, every ounce of his considerable power to ensure that the family went from respectable gentry to the edge of ruin. Her sister's marriage prospects disappeared. Her parents' social standing crumbled. The modest estate in Derbyshire had to be sold to pay debts Julian had carefully engineered. And through it all, Philippa said nothing. Simply watched him with those gray eyes that had once looked at him with love and now held nothing but contempt. Julian told himself he didn't care. Told himself this was necessary, that she needed to understand the consequences of refusing him. But the darkness was growing, consuming everything, and even he was beginning to suspect that he'd become the thing he'd spent his life trying to avoid. His father, destructive, cruel, willing to harm innocent people to satisfy his own twisted needs. The breaking point came on a February evening, 1 year after Julian had first seen Philippa standing behind that potted palm at her family's ball. He stood in his study, reviewing the final paperwork that would force the sale of the Hartwell factories to cover manufactured debts. This was the last piece. After this, the family would be completely ruined, dependent entirely on Julian's financial support to survive. He'd won. He'd proven his power. He'd ensured that Philippa could never leave him, never choose the memory of her dead fiancé over her living husband, because she and her entire family were now completely dependent on his goodwill. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, Julian felt hollow, empty, monstrous. What had he done? The question crashed through him with devastating force. What had he done? He destroyed an innocent family, a family that had welcomed him, that had given him their daughter in good faith because he couldn't control his own jealousy. because he'd been so consumed by fear of not being enough that he'd become the thing he'd always been terrified of becoming. His father's son, a man who destroyed people he claimed to love. Julian looked up to find Philippa standing in the doorway of his study. He didn't know how long she'd been there, watching him stare at the contracts in his hands. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness and pain, but her spine was straight. She'd dressed for traveling, he realized with a jolt. A simple day dress, a cloak, no jewelry except her wedding ring. "Are you going somewhere?" he heard himself ask, his voice hoarse. Yes. She stepped into the room, but didn't approach his desk. Maintained the distance between them that had become their default over these terrible months. "My parents have lost everything. The estate is sold. The factories are gone. My sisters have no prospects. They're moving to a small cottage in Norfolk. The only property we have left, a tenant farm my grandfather left to my mother. Too insignificant for you to bother destroying. I'm going with them." Julian felt his entire world tilt. "You're leaving me." "I'm leaving this." She gestured around the study, but Julian understood she meant more than the room. She meant the cold mansion, the separate bedrooms, the marriage that had become a battlefield. "I'm leaving the cage you built when you couldn't trust that I chose you freely, when you decided that controlling me was more important than loving me." "You can't leave," Julian said, and heard the desperation creeping into his voice. "You're my wife. You're—" "I'm nothing," Philippa interrupted, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "That's what you've made me, Julian. Nothing. A possession you punished when it didn't behave as expected. You destroyed my family, innocent people, who never hurt you because I dared to maintain my own grief, my own history, my own identity, separate from you." She finally moved closer, but stopped several feet away, as if afraid to get within his reach. "You became exactly what you were terrified of becoming. You became your father." The words landed like physical blows. Julian felt something inside him crack completely. Something that had been splintering for months under the weight of his own cruelty. "I know," he whispered. "God help me, Philippa. I know. I've been seeing it for weeks now, watching myself destroy you and your family and being unable to stop because if I stopped, I'd have to face what I've become." "Then face it," she said. "Face what you've done. Face that you took the man I fell in love with, the one who feared he'd loved too much, who worried about orphans and factory workers and buried him so deep under cruelty and control that I can't find him anymore." Julian looked at her, at the woman he'd claimed to love, so consuming it justified any action, and saw clearly for the first time in months, saw that he hadn't loved her, not really. He'd wanted to own her, to possess her so completely that she couldn't have any identity, any history, any loyalty that didn't begin and end with him. That wasn't love. That was the kind of destruction his father had specialized in. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words were hopelessly inadequate. "I'm so sorry, Philippa. You were right about everything. About the cage. About me trying to erase the parts of you I didn't create. About becoming possessive instead of loving." He moved around the desk slowly, carefully, the way one might approach a wounded animal. "I've spent the last year destroying everything I claimed to love because I was too afraid to trust that you chose me freely, too afraid to believe I could be enough without controlling every aspect of your world." "That's not love," Philippa said again, but Julian heard the crack in her voice. "That's fear, fear disguised as devotion. And Julian, I can't live with that fear. I can't watch you destroy everyone around us every time you feel insecure. I can't spend my life managing your emotions at the expense of my own autonomy." "I know." Julian stopped moving, maintaining the distance between them, even though everything in him screamed to close it. "You're right to leave. You're right that I've become monstrous. And if you take your parents and sisters to Norfolk and never speak to me again, I won't stop you. I'll restore your family's fortune. I'll quietly repair all the business relationships I destroyed. I'll ensure your sisters have dowries and prospects. and I'll let you go, because that's what loving you actually requires." Philippa stared at him, shock replacing some of the wariness in her eyes. "You'll let me go? If that's what you need to be free of what I've become, yes." Julian felt tears burning in his own eyes now, the first he'd allowed himself in months. "I won't trap you, Philippa. Won't use my power to force you to stay in a marriage that's become a prison. You were right. I built you a beautiful cage, and I'm giving you the key." The silence stretched between them. Julian watched emotions war across Philippa's face: disbelief, grief, exhaustion, and something else. Something that looked almost like hope. "What if," she said finally, her voice barely audible, "what if I don't want to leave? What if I want my husband back? The real one, not the monster who's been wearing his face for the past year?" Julian felt his breath catch. "You can't possibly want Philippa. I destroyed your family. I'm not sure there's anything left to come back from." "But you recognize what you did," she said, taking a step closer. "You see how you became your father, and you're willing to let me go, to do the right thing, even though it destroys you. That's the difference, Julian. Your father never saw his own cruelty, never changed, never chose his victim's freedom over his own desires. Another step. Can you promise me, truly promise that you'll never do this again? That if I choose to stay, to try to rebuild what we had, you won't revert to destroying people when you feel threatened?" Julian wanted to promise, wanted to tell her yes, immediately, that he'd changed permanently. But he'd learned something over these terrible months. Good intentions meant nothing without honest self-knowledge. "I can't promise I'll never struggle with jealousy again," he said carefully. "I can't promise that my intensity won't sometimes feel like too much. But I can promise that I'll never use my power to punish you or anyone you love. I can promise that I'll get help, that I'll see a doctor about these consuming emotions, that I'll do whatever work is necessary to ensure I never become this version of myself again. And I can promise that if you tell me you need space, need time, need to maintain relationships or memories or parts of yourself that aren't about me, I'll respect that boundary even when it terrifies me." Philippa moved closer still, until she stood directly before him. Close enough that Julian could smell the lavender water she used, could see the exhaustion in the fine lines around her eyes. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. "I want to stay, but I can't stay with the Duke, who destroyed my family. I can only stay with Julian, the man who's terrified he'll love wrong, but who's willing to do the work to love right." Julian felt his knees buckle, not figuratively, literally, buckle beneath him. He dropped to the floor before her, his hands gripping her skirts, his face pressed against the fabric covering her waist. "Forgive me," he gasped, the words tearing out of him. "Philippa, please, forgive me. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your choice. I'll restore what I destroyed. I'll be better. Her hands came to his hair, threading through it the way she used to in the early days of their marriage. "Get up, Julian. Please get up." He lifted his face to look at her, still on his knees, before her. "Let me do this. Let me kneel here and acknowledge what I've done. You were right to call it possession. Right to say I tried to erase you. Right about all of it. And I'm begging you to give me the chance to prove I can do better. Julian." She pulled gently on his hair, urging him to stand, but he remained on his knees. "You're the Duke of Ravenscroft. You don't beg anyone." "I don't care about being a duke," Julian interrupted roughly. "I care about being your husband, and your husband is begging, on his knees, for another chance to love you the way you deserve. Not with possession, not with control, but with trust. With respect for who you are, including the parts of you that existed before me and will exist independent of me." Philippa was crying openly now, her hands still in his hair. "If I stay, if we try this again, it has to be different. You have to actually see a doctor about these emotions." "You have to do the work, not just promise to do the work. And the first sign that you're reverting, the first time you try to control me or use your power to punish anyone I love, I'm leaving. Permanently. No second chances. No negotiations. Agreed, Julian said immediately. All of it. Whatever you need. I'll restore your family's fortune publicly, so everyone knows I was wrong. I'll spread word that the Hartwell factories are sound investments, that your sisters are excellent matches. I'll undo every piece of damage I caused. And you'll trust me, Philippa added, even when it's hard, even when I need to maintain connections to my past, or my family, or parts of myself that don't include you. You'll trust that I chose you, and that choice doesn't require me to erase everything else. I'll trust you, Julian vowed. I swear it, Philippa. On everything I am, everything I have, I'll trust your choice and your love, even when my fear whispers that I'm not enough. She pulled him up then, finally, and he rose from his knees to stand before her. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two people who'd nearly destroyed something precious through fear and intensity, and the kind of love that could easily tip into destruction without careful tending. I choose you, Philippa said softly. I choose the man who just knelt before me and acknowledged his failures, who promised to do better, who's willing to let me go if that's what freedom requires. That's the man I fell in love with, Julian. The one who feels too much, but is willing to learn how to channel that intensity into building rather than destroying. Julian pulled her into his arms then, holding her carefully, reverently, as if she were something infinitely precious that he'd almost lost through his own stupidity. I don't deserve you, he murmured against her hair. Probably not, she agreed. And he could hear the small smile in her voice. Minus lass, wanus lass, minus lass, and he says wanus lass, and wanus lass, and he says wanus lass, minus lass, minus lass. But you're going to spend the rest of our lives earning me anyway, and Julian, I'm going to hold you to that promise. The first sign of reversion. The first time you prioritize control over trust. And I'm gone. This is Head. With Rangston today brings pie. This is Sar.or letter. The first sign of reversion with matter. This isn't Sar Jang. This isn't Sarge. Now. The first sign of reversion with matter. Reversion. Understood. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. I see you, Philippa. Really see you. Not as a possession or an extension of myself, but as your own person with your own history and autonomy. And I'm asking, not demanding, asking if you'll help me learn how to love you the way you deserve. How to channel this intensity into devotion instead of destruction. She reached up to touch his face, her gray eyes searching his. That's all I ever wanted. Not a perfect man, just one willing to do the work of becoming better. They held each other there in Julian's study, surrounded by the contracts that represented his cruelty. Two people who'd survived the darkness that had nearly consumed them both. It wouldn't be easy, Julian knew. He'd have to see doctors about the jealousy and possessiveness, have to do the difficult work of learning to trust rather than control. Philippa would have to learn to believe in his change, to give him chances to prove his transformation was real. But they'd survived the worst of it. Survived Julian becoming his father, survived Philippa's refusal to be reduced to a possession. And if they could survive that, if they could look at each other across the wreckage of what they'd nearly destroyed and choose to rebuild, then maybe, just maybe, they could create something even stronger than what they'd started with. Come to bed, Philippa said finally. Our bed, not separate rooms. I want my husband back. Julian felt tears stream down his face unchecked. You have him. For better or worse, you have all of me. The intensity, the fear, the desperate love, all of it. But this time, I'll remember that love means setting you free, not building you a cage. And I'll remember, Philippa said, taking his hand and leading him from the study, that you need reassurance sometimes, that your fear of not being enough is real, even when unfounded. We'll figure it out together, Julian. the right way to love each other, the way that makes us both free rather than imprisoned. They climbed the stairs to their shared bedroom, hand in hand, two people beginning the long work of transformation. Julian knew he'd spend years proving he meant every word, years earning back the trust he'd shattered. But Philippa had chosen to stay, had chosen to believe in his capacity for change. And this time, he wouldn't fail her. He wouldn't let his fear win. He would learn to love her the way she deserved. With trust, with respect, with the kind of intensity that built rather than destroyed. Because she'd refused the Duke of Ravenscroft once before, had said she couldn't marry the title. And tonight, kneeling on the floor of his study, Julian had finally understood what she meant. The Duke was power and control, and the kind of ruthlessness that destroyed families on a whim. But Julian Ashworth was capable of change, capable of choosing love over fear, freedom over possession, growth over destruction. And that was the man Philippa had agreed to spend her life with. Not the perfect man, just the one willing to keep trying, keep working, keep choosing her freedom over his fear, forever.